Hello, bonjour. Thank you for having myself and Julian virtually. We prefer, of course, to be in Canada, but we're very grateful for the opportunity to present on Indigenous languages in Parlement, a comparison between Australia and Canada. My name's Tim Goodwin. I'm a barrister here in Melbourne, Australia, and have been for 6 years, specialising in public law and also commercial law, but also as a Yuin man, an Aboriginal Australian whose people are from the south coast of New South Wales. I'm particularly passionate about Indigenous legal issues, and as an Aboriginal person, passionate about Indigenous languages. We are speaking at a very unique and interesting time in the world, not only because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but because of some of the calls and action for racial justice around the world. The Black Lives Matter movement arising from the murder of George Floyd has hit Australia as well in terms of the renewed focus on Indigenous deaths in custody, an issue for all Indigenous peoples, particularly in the Kansas nations. But as a positive, it occurs at a particular political moment in Australia where we are considering more broadly the place of Indigenous people in our nation. There are currently a number of movements to negotiate contemporary treaties amongst the states that make up Australia, including here in Victoria. And there is an agreement in place in Victoria for a truth-telling commission to be established to operate similarly to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a precursor to the negotiation of a treaty and to deal with healing. At the same time, Indigenous languages are coming to the forefront. There's a lot of work being done to rebuild and resuscitate language around Australia, including my own grandmother's people, the Wiradjuri. I now have an app on my iPhone of a dictionary of Wiradjuri language because of the work of elders and linguists to piece together that language. Which brings us really to the topic of Indigenous languages in Parliament. In May 2017, Robert Falcon Ouellette gave a speech to the Canadian House of Commons on violence within Indigenous communities. Ouellette spoke in Cree because he wanted to address the violence in a manner that would be noticed and to reach the younger population. However, it's arguable that Ouellette, in doing so, contravened the standing orders of the House of Commons. After the speech, Ouellette objected to the status quo, and the Standing Committee in Procedure and House Affairs conducted an inquiry about the use of Indigenous languages in House proceedings and committees. During the course of that inquiry, a witness from Australia, Michael Tatham, Clerk of the Legislative Assembly of the Northern Territory, gave evidence and explained the extent to which Indigenous languages were then accommodated within the Northern Territory Parliament. How his evidence found its way into the final report suggests that there are potentially some shared experiences between Canada and Australia, despite the significant differences between the obstacles to Indigenous parliamentary involvement in both our countries. In this presentation, we hope to outline the current position in Australia with respect to the use of Indigenous languages in Parliament. And in the course of our discussion, we'll focus in particular on recent developments, and where possible, we draw on comparisons with the Canadian experience. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Indigenous languages in Australia and then hand over to Julian to discuss Indigenous languages in Parliament. It's helpful to start by providing an overview of the current state of Indigenous languages in Australia and to compare that with the position in Canada. Indigenous people make up about 3% of the Australian population, although that position is considerably higher in certain jurisdictions, such as the Northern Territory, where Indigenous peoples make up about 35% of the constituency. For comparison, in Canada, Indigenous people make up 4.9% of the population, but make up a majority of the population in some provinces and territories. So, for example, in Nunavut, 86% of the population are Indigenous peoples, and 51% of the population in the Northwest Territories are Indigenous. About 18% of Indigenous Australians speak an Indigenous language, including about 11% who speak it as the main language at home. Again, this portion is significantly higher in some places, particularly remote regions, where over half of Indigenous people speak an Indigenous language. In Canada, by comparison, 16% of Indigenous people speak an Indigenous language. It is estimated that there are presently about 141 Indigenous language varieties spoken throughout Australia, whereas the comparative number in Canada is about 70. Many of those languages, however, are only spoken by relatively small numbers of people, and even the stronger languages are considered under threat. In the last few decades, there has been an increasing public awareness, particularly among non-Indigenous Australians, of the importance of preserving and protecting Indigenous languages. This recognition has resulted in some important developments, including the development of legislation and policy to protect Indigenous languages and the limited inclusion of some Indigenous languages within school curricula. The above picture of Indigenous languages in Australia suggests three important similarities with Canada. First, Indigenous peoples make up a relatively small proportion of the national population in both countries. Secondly, both Australia and Canada being federations, Indigenous people make up a significant portion of the population in some subnational jurisdictions. Thirdly, there's no single common Indigenous language in either country, but rather a rich diversity of languages. In each of these three respects, Canada and Australia can be contrasted with New Zealand, which is a unitary jurisdiction with a significant Indigenous population and a single language. I'll hand over now to my colleague, Julian Murphy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'm Julian Murphy, and in the second half of our presentation today, I'd like to speak a bit about how Indigenous languages are presently being incorporated into parliamentary debate around Australia, what some of the procedures are that are currently in place for that to happen, and how they might be better advanced and progressed and changed and amended to make that happen in a more holistic and regular fashion. And I think there's some lessons to be learned from Canada in that respect. So I'll just start by saying that Indigenous languages have been used in Australian parliaments for quite some time now. The earliest example that we could find was 1981. And I think it's fair to say that the usage of Indigenous languages has really increased at quite a steady rate since 1981, especially in recent years where it's happening a lot more commonly. However, it is true that many of the uses of Indigenous languages in Australian parliaments occur in ceremonial, symbolic or formal contexts. So often there'll be small or short phrases used in inaugural speeches or at the start of ceremonial proceedings or particularly important or significant occasions. It's a lot more rare, it's a lot rarer for that Indigenous languages to be used in substantive parliamentary debate in the sort of to and fro over legislative agenda items or in policy debate or impromptu responses to questions. And part of the reason for that is that there hasn't really been a mechanism for it or an appetite for it really in the standing orders of the various Australian parliaments. However, there has been some real developments on that front in recent years, and a lot of it started with an incident in one subnational jurisdiction in Australia called the Northern Territory in 2015. And there are some real harmonies here with the incident that happened in the Canadian House of Commons with Robert Falcon Willett that Tim referred to earlier, but I'll just talk about the Northern Territory incident. So what happened was that in 2015, an Indigenous Member of Parliament in the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly started using and was using her first language, an Indigenous language, in parliamentary debate. And she was using it in an impromptu manner in response to questions with another Member of Parliament. And the Speaker of the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly made a ruling that if the Indigenous parliamentarian concerned continued to use the Indigenous language, she would be ruled disorderly. After that incident, there was an exchange of letters, a public exchange of letters between the Indigenous parliamentarian concerned and the Speaker about the present situation and what was deemed to be, by many, an unsatisfactory state of affairs, where you have a jurisdiction with around 30% Indigenous constituency, many of whom are Indigenous language speakers, but the use of an Indigenous language in Parliament could potentially be ruled disorderly. As a result of that incident, there's been some real changes in the Northern Territory, but it's taken a long time and it's still an evolving situation. So there's been 3 separate parliamentary inquiries in the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly into how Indigenous languages might be better incorporated to parliamentary proceedings. And because of the nature of the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly and the Northern Territory generally as having such a high Indigenous population, relatively speaking, this is essentially an experiment for the rest of Australia that the rest of Australia is watching, and parliaments around Australia are watching to see how this is facilitated. So essentially what happened is that in 2015, before the events that I've described, there wasn't any provision for the use of an Indigenous language, and it was, when it occurred by leave of the Speaker, usually with an interpretation by the Indigenous parliamentarian immediately following. One of the advances that came through these various parliamentary inquiries was that a specific standing order was introduced that gave an entitlement to parliamentarians to use an Indigenous language in parliamentary debate if they gave reasonable notice and if they provided written translations into English ahead of time and an oral translation into English before using the Indigenous language. Now, the advantage of that standing order was that it gave an entitlement in unambiguous terms to an Indigenous parliamentarian, or indeed any parliamentarian, to use an Indigenous language. Some of the problems with that standing order, however, were that it required quite a bit of work beforehand and notice beforehand in order to use an Indigenous language and the provision of those written interpretations that I've referred to. That was considered to be a problem including by Indigenous parliamentarians, and after another inquiry, it was actually determined that that standing order would be scrapped, and the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly has now reverted essentially to the situation it was in before, where parliamentarians can seek the leave of the Speaker, give advance notice, and generally what is permitted now is an interpreter be present on the floor of the Parliament to simultaneously translate Indigenous language into English. And that's deemed to work relatively well, notwithstanding the requirement for advance notice and the like. But there is, as we perceive it at least, a problem in the fact that there is an unambiguous entitlement to use an Indigenous language, and there are still obstacles in terms of the advance notice requirement, which would obviously prevent impromptu and sort of responsive uses of Indigenous languages. Interestingly, the situation as it currently stands in the Northern Territory appears to be very similar to the situation in the Canadian Senate and the House of Commons, where Indigenous languages have been used, perhaps not infrequently, but there is this, there's no mention of Indigenous languages in the rules or the standing orders, which refer simply to the official languages being English and French. So there's no strict entitlement, but there are these informal procedures for using Indigenous languages. And as a final note, and perhaps to spur kind of further research and discussion on this issue, what we'd like to do is highlight the fact that the subnational Canadian jurisdictions, and particularly the territories, offer a real opportunity for learning for jurisdictions in Australia, and particularly the Northern Territory, as to where we might go next in terms of more holistically incorporating Indigenous languages into parliamentary proceedings. And particularly the Northwest Territories, Yukon, they have unambiguous entitlements in their standing orders or their legislative structures for the use of Indigenous languages, and the opportunity to have those parliamentary debates simultaneously translated. And we think that offers a model that should be very seriously considered in the Northern Territory, and hopefully by other Australian jurisdictions around Australia who are looking at the Northern Territory as an example. So with that, we'll leave that sort of open possibility of comparison and further reciprocal learning as a point for future discussion and future research. And we look forward to the questions and the engagement that we'll be able to have on this in the conference panel session. Thank you.